Hello and thanks for joining us at interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today I'm joined by Climate Change Minister, Associate Finance Minister and Green Party co-leader, James Shaw. Thanks for your time, James.
Thank you for having me.
I was really interested to listen to a podcast that you've been doing called What Comes After What Comes Next. And you spoke to Christiana Figueres, who's the former head of the UN Convention on Climate Change. And you seem to have a bit of agreement on this idea that with COVID we have governments are borrowing and spending so much, and we really have this opportunity to invest wisely and in a way that really benefits future generations. You sort of talked about it being quite a short window because we can't do this again in another 10 years' time or something. Could you just explain that rationale a wee bit?
Yeah, I've actually been trying to not cast it as an opportunity, but more as a responsibility. So the theory that I'm working to is we're currently borrowing tens of billions of dollars off our children and grandchildren because they're the taxpayers of the future that are going to have to pay it back. So we're borrowing money that they would otherwise have to spend. And we're doing that to get ourselves through this current crisis. And that's fine, right? That's just in the nature of things. But it does mean every dollar that we borrow and spend today to get us through this crisis is a dollar that they cannot spend on getting them through another crisis that they will also be faced with. And we already know what some of those crises are, right? There's the climate crisis, the housing crisis, biodiversity crisis. Each of those things is quite a big ticket item to have to deal with. And so I think that it's an economic duty, but also a moral duty to use the stimulus money that we're currently spending on those things so that they don't have the double whammy of paying for our crisis and their crisis at the same time.
Sure, right. Crises on top of crises.
Yeah.
I'd just like to talk through, I guess, what we need to do, in your view, to make sure that we do this well. And if we start at the borrowing side of things, our viewers will know that the Reserve Bank is undertaking quantitative easing for the first time. And the way it's doing this is by buying New Zealand government bonds on the secondary market. So it's buying these bonds from banks and other bond holders. And some sort of economic observers are saying, why don't we cut out the middleman, and why doesn't the Reserve Bank buy these bonds straight from the government? So instead of having all this money trickle through the banking system, which means it doesn't always get to people who need it, let's just go direct and get this done. Obviously breaks all sorts of traditional conventions, but what is your thought on that?
In a time like this, I think you have to say, look, everything has to be on the table for investigation. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to pull all those levers. But I think it is worth a thorough going over. Now, one of the criticisms of it, quantitative easing in general, was that the last time you saw anything on this scale, and of course we're now exceeding the scale, was actually only 12 years ago during the GFC.
Yeah.
And that what happened in the GFC is that simply led to a massive asset price bubble. And that has had huge secondary impacts, including our own housing crisis here in New Zealand.
Yes.
And similar house price affordability issues, in other countries as well. And so essentially that QE wasn't put to anything useful, like the real economy, and simply went into the hands of those asset owners. And you can actually see a bit of a repeat of that with stock markets are currently performing really well, including in the United States, where they've got 20% unemployment, and rising on a daily basis. And I think that shows something about the availability of cash, but it also shows the extent to which listed companies, or the makeup of bourses around the world is increasingly disconnected from, what we might describe as the real economy. That they're now just two different things.
So do you believe that Grant Robertson should go to Adrian Orr and say, look, we'd like to increase benefits more and we need $5 billion, and can you print some money and give it to us to do that? Or we'll issue bonds, you buy the bonds specifically for this one fiscal policy?
Well, there's a lot in there I want to unpick, right? you talked about raising benefits. If you do that, and let's say it cost you $5 billion, that's not just $5 billion this year, that's $5 billion every year. So that would mean that you're not just borrowing it for this year, you're actually borrowing it every year, unless you increase revenue on an ongoing basis. That's not currently on the table. So you need to disaggregate things that you want to spend money on in the short term, for which you use borrowing, versus things, CapEx, right? It's a CapEx, OpEx thing. Benefits are OpEx, and so that has to be a revenue solution rather than a debt funded solution. But CapEx is definitely a debt thing. So do I think that we should use that methodology? I think it's worth investigating, but I'm not going to claim to be expert enough to be able to say whether I think it's a good idea or a bad idea. But I think that we've probably got the right people now who are willing to who are open-minded enough to kind of investigate, but also actually have the economic chops to be able to come to a position which is either that's a good idea or it isn't.
Yes, and just for people listening, Adrian Orr has sort of said that it's achievable, and Grant Robertson has said, sort of is not that keen, and the market's functioning fine at the moment. So, but it's also on the table. Well,
we're doing okay at the moment. And with an idea like that, which is largely untested, at a time like this, which is a moment of enormous crisis, it's not necessarily the best time to go experimenting at scale, right? So maybe if you were to do it, you might want to bite off a very small chunk and kind of see what effect it has, but treat it very cautiously.
Sure.
And I think Grant feels the weight of responsibility to make sure. But at the moment, because our borrowing was so low to start with, we're kind of heading into the 50-60% of GDP territory now, which obviously isn't comfortable. But actually, all the feedback that we're getting is that from the markets is that actually the markets are actually reasonably comfortable with that, especially when you compare it to overseas. And the cost of borrowing is so low. I can see why Grant's saying, we're doing all right. Let's not necessarily venture off on any great new.
Well, actually, that brings me to my next thing. I've been pondering this quite a bit. That. Do we use a crisis to change things, or do we actually change things in the times when they're good? So, I mean, all the sort of economics that we have at the moment are based on keeping asset prices where they are. We don't want them to fall because people borrow against these assets. And if they fall, then that sort of everything crumbles. It's like
it's a house of cards. It's a completely unsustainable way of running an economy.
But is now the time to change that?
Instinctively, I actually say yes. Because it's a bit like, companies that invest during a downturn do a lot better than those that cut during a downturn. And you can understand, like when there's a downturn, people want to cut costs, and so they pare back their headcount and, reduce their order book and, all of that kind of stuff. But often, in a significant downturn, they will simply cut too close to the bone. And it means that as the economy recovers, they actually don't have enough of an operation to rise along with the rising tide. Whereas those companies that go, okay, prices are lower now than they were a few months ago, let's cut some deals, borrow, invest, and actually build the operation, maybe take a bit of a moment to retool and retask about, where we think that we might have been going. Those companies historically have done very well on the other side as things have recovered. Now, obviously, a national economy doesn't work the same way as a company, but often if you try to do major reforms when things are really humming along and prices are actually inflated, that's a really tough time to change things because people's vested interests are in the status quo, right? I'm making money. Don't mess with it, please, whatever you do. But if you do see a significant market correction and prices, including house prices and other asset prices and so on, are down anyway, actually in some ways that's the ideal time to do structural reform because you're messing with a system that's already messed with.
Sure.
And then you retool, and then as the economy recovers, it actually just grows into the new shape. And I've been making this argument recently, yesterday, in relation to emissions trading reform. Actually, it was harder and more expensive 3 months ago than it is now, because carbon prices were higher, petrol prices were higher, everything, and so if the reforms that we're doing introduce a few more cents per litre on petrol, well, given the fact that petrol's dropped 48 cents a litre in the past 12 weeks, means that adding 3 cents right now, you don't feel it, right? But if you tried to introduce it when, people felt like they were paying too much for their petrol, you add another 3 cents per litre on, then you get the kickback.
In terms of the way the government's spending money, helicopter money is something that everyone's talking about, that our viewers are sometimes quite interested in. Is that something the Green Party is keen on?
Yeah, well, it's again, in the sense of everything has got to be on the table, yes. And actually, if you think about the push that we've been making on welfare reform, that is effectively helicopter money, right? Because the notion of helicopter money is you simply write a check to everyone, and then they go out and spend it, right? And so you get a demand side boost to the economy. Now, the people who are kind of worst off in an income sense in our society are also the people, if you wrote them a check for $1,000, they would spend every single penny of that. Yeah. You write it out to, someone like you or I, there's a reasonable chance that we would simply bank it.
Or not.
Or use it to pay, a reasonable portion of it, right?
Yes, yeah.
And actually the point of helicopter money is to get cash circulating. And so actually focusing on income support for the people who are worst off is a really good way to get money moving through the economy, and like I would say, in the real part of the economy, right? They're spending it at dairies and supermarkets and, electricity companies, and they're using it to pay rent and, all
it's
of that.
It's not sort of numbers in the banking
No,
system.
that's right. Every dollar that they spend actually gets reflected in goods and services, right? Yeah. As opposed to, putting it into a bank where it makes no difference at all.
In terms of, the Green Party in this term of government, I sense that there have at times been a bit of frustration because you're working with a coalition government and there's different interests there. Do you believe that if you got in with Labour at the next election and New Zealand First wasn't necessary, how much more progress do you think you can make
How much less frustrating an experience would it be?
on welfare reform?
Yeah.
How much more could you get through?
Significant.
Look, I just finally want to talk about repaying this debt. Will you go into the election proposing a capital gains tax again, or not?
Well, I can't say what we're going to have in our manifesto,
right.
But we're actively looking at all of the options. We've never changed our policy on capital gains tax, right? I mean, that was our policy when we entered Parliament in 1999. It remains our policy today. The extent to which we'll lead with that or with something else is yet to be revealed.
Okay, because given the government, or Labour, I guess, has kind of just recently, Grant Robertson has said no, we will not do a capital gains tax. I just wonder whether the Green Party will look at a different type of tax and sort of push to take something else to the public.
Well, we're looking. I mean, we are considering the options, and I have to say we're doing quite a lot of rework in light of COVID. We had a plan, and then, like everybody, our plans got messed with by the pandemic crisis. So we are in the middle of that at the moment. But if you were to go back to first principles and you said, well, why would you want a capital gains tax or something akin to it? The capital income tax that Michael Cullen and his team were proposing. Though that rationale, I think, makes even more sense now than it did previously, and in part it's to deal with this issue with stimulus money flowing through into asset prices rather than into the real economy. So I'll give you an example. There's some quantitative easing that gets used to pay for wage subsidies. The people who receive that wage subsidy use it to pay their rent, and the rent goes to a property owner. Now, what that basically means is that you're printing money and putting it into the hands of property owners who were doing okay previously. It doesn't actually do much else other than keep the status quo going. If you want to recoup that in any way, then the only thing that makes sense is to say that this large untaxed part of the economy, which is, wealth and capital, versus the part that we do tax, i.e. labour and consumer spending via GST, actually we need to think about that.
James Shaw, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. And I'm Janae Tibshirani from interests.co.nz.